He married her as a joke. A bet with his friends. $1 million to marry a woman he'd never normally look at twice. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of a man he'd destroyed. A man who'd taken his own life because of him. And she didn't come for his money. She came for revenge. This is the story of how a cruel bet became the most painful lesson of his life. And how sometimes the people we hurt the most become the ones who save us. Stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart and put it back together again. Welcome to the City of Stories. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you a story about a man who thought he had everything figured out. His name was Daniel Foster, and he was one of those property developers you read about in magazines. The kind who buys up entire neighborhoods and turns them into luxury apartments. He had money, power, and an ego the size of a mansion. Daniel lived in Boston, in a penthouse that overlooked the entire city. Everything he touched turned to gold, or so he believed. He wasn't just rich. He was the kind of man who made sure everyone knew it. Designer suits, expensive cars, and a different woman on his arm every month. And these women, they all looked like they'd stepped off magazine covers. Tall, thin, perfectly styled. Daniel had a type, and everyone knew it. One evening, at a fancy party in downtown Boston, Daniel was celebrating another successful deal. Champagne was flowing, and his friends were congratulating him on yet another victory. That's when his childhood friend, Robert, walked up to him with a mischievous smile. "Daniel," Robert said, raising his glass, "you've conquered everything in business. But I wonder if you could win at something a little more personal." Daniel laughed, that confident laugh of someone who'd never really lost at anything. "What are you talking about?" Robert leaned in closer. "I bet you couldn't handle marrying a woman who doesn't fit your usual type. Someone real. Someone who won't fall for your money or your charm. Someone who doesn't look like those model types you usually date." The room went quiet. Everyone was listening now. Daniel felt all eyes on him, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. "How much are we talking about?" Daniel asked, his competitive spirit kicking in. $1 million, Robert said simply. "But there's a catch. You have to stay married for 6 months. And I get to choose the woman." Daniel didn't even hesitate. To him, this was just another deal, another game to win. He shook Robert's hand right there, sealing his fate without knowing what he was getting himself into. A few days later, Robert told him about the woman, Natalie Carter. Daniel had never heard of her, but Robert assured him she was perfect for the bet. A plus-size woman who was nothing like the thin, glamorous women Daniel usually pursued. When they finally arranged to meet at a restaurant in the city, Daniel expected someone he could easily charm and control, someone who would be grateful for his attention. But the moment Natalie walked in, he was caught off guard. She was a large woman, yes, her body soft and full in ways that contradicted everything Daniel typically found attractive. But she didn't walk in apologetically or self-consciously. She moved with her head held high, with genuine confidence that had nothing to do with her size. She wore simple clothes that fit her well, and when she looked at Daniel, there wasn't a trace of nervousness or the desperate need to impress him that he was used to seeing. "You must be Daniel," she said, her voice steady and calm. "And you're Natalie," he replied, standing up awkwardly, trying to hide his surprise. She sat down without waiting for him to pull out her chair, meeting his gaze directly with eyes that seemed to see right through him. She got straight to the point. "I know about the bet. I know why we're here. I know Robert told you I don't look like your usual type. And I want you to understand something right from the start. I'm not some prize you can win, and I'm not going to be grateful that someone like you is giving someone like me attention. If we're doing this, we do it on my terms." Daniel was taken aback. He'd expected her to be flattered, maybe even eager for the opportunity to be with someone wealthy and successful. But Natalie was different. She didn't seem impressed by his wealth or his status. In fact, she seemed almost uninterested. "So why did you agree to this?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about her motivations. Natalie paused, her eyes revealing nothing. "Let's just say I have my reasons. 6 months may seem short, but a lot can change in that time. Don't think for a second that I'm here because I'm desperate for your approval or your money." Something about the way she said it made Daniel feel uneasy, like there was more to this story than he understood. But his pride pushed those thoughts aside. He was Daniel Foster. He always came out on top. They agreed to the arrangement, signed the papers, and within a week, they were married in a quick, cold ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a wedding. There was no love, no romance, just two people entering into an agreement. After the ceremony, Daniel brought Natalie to his penthouse, expecting her to be amazed by the luxury. He showed her the expensive furniture, the view of the city, the walk-in closet full of designer clothes he'd bought for her, though he'd had to guess at her size and used to shopping for a woman with her body type. But Natalie barely glanced at any of it. "This is very nice," she said flatly, "but I don't need any of this. I'll stay in the guest room. Keep your distance, and we'll get through these 6 months just fine." Daniel felt frustrated. This wasn't going according to plan. Usually, his wealth opened every door, won every heart. But Natalie was treating his $1 million penthouse like it was just another room. Over the next few days, Daniel tried everything. He bought her jewelry, she left it in the box. He arranged expensive dinners, she preferred to eat simple meals alone. He tried to impress her with his business success, she changed the subject. It was driving him crazy. For the first time in his life, Daniel Foster was being ignored by a woman he'd thought would be desperate for his attention, and he didn't know how to handle it. Late one night, he found her on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. He decided to try a different approach, honesty. "Natalie," he said softly, "why are you really here? This can't just be about the agreement." She turned to look at him, and for a brief moment he saw something in her eyes, pain, anger, something deep and old. 6 months, Daniel," she repeated. "That's all you need to know." And with that, she walked back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and a growing feeling that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know it yet, but Natalie Carter wasn't just a woman who agreed to a bet. She was someone from his past, someone whose life he'd destroyed without even knowing it. And she was about to make him pay for every single thing he'd done. The first month of their marriage was torture for Daniel, but not in the way he expected. Natalie lived in his penthouse like a ghost, present but untouchable. She had her own routine, her own life, and she treated him like he was invisible. Daniel was used to being the center of attention wherever he went. But in his own home, he was nothing. Natalie would make herself breakfast and leave without a word. She'd come home late, go straight to her room, and close the door. When he tried to talk to her, she'd give him one-word answers and walk away. What made it worse was his own confusion about his feelings. He'd married her thinking this would be easy, that a plus-size woman would be grateful for his attention, eager to please him. But Natalie's complete indifference to him, her total lack of interest in his approval, was making him see her differently. She wasn't trying to hide her body or apologize for it. She moved through the world with a confidence that came from somewhere deeper than physical appearance, and it was unlike anything he'd experienced with the model-thin women he usually dated. It was humiliating, and it was making him obsessed. He started watching her more closely, trying to figure her out. Who was this woman who could resist everything he offered? What made her so different? And why did she look at him sometimes with such cold hatred? One evening, about 5 weeks into their arrangement, Daniel came home early from work. He'd had a particularly bad day. A deal had fallen through, and several of his investors were asking difficult questions. All he wanted was to pour himself a drink and forget about it. But when he walked into the penthouse, he found Natalie in the living room, looking at old newspaper articles on her laptop. She didn't hear him come in, and he stood there for a moment watching her. Her face was intense, focused, and there was something about her expression that made his stomach turn. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Natalie jumped slightly, then quickly closed her laptop. But it was too late. Daniel had seen enough, old articles about property developments, legal battles, families being displaced. "Nothing that concerns you," she said coldly. But Daniel's instincts were firing now. Something was wrong. He walked closer, and Natalie stood up, her full frame facing him with that same unreadable expression. "Who are you really?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet but firm. "And don't tell me you're just someone who needed money. I know that's not true." For a long moment, Natalie said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, ready to snap. Then finally she spoke. "You really don't remember, do you?" Daniel felt his heart start to race. "Remember what?" Natalie laughed, but it was a bitter, painful sound. "Of course you don't. Why would you? You destroy so many lives. How could you possibly keep track of them all? And people like me, we're invisible to people like you anyway, aren't we?" "What are you talking about?" Daniel demanded, feeling panic rising in his chest. My last name is Carter, Natalie said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. Does that mean anything to you? My father was Thomas Carter. Daniel's mind raced through memories, through deals, through names and faces. And then it hit him. Thomas Carter, the developer who owned a small company about 8 years ago. Daniel had wanted the land Carter owned, prime real estate in a growing neighborhood. When Carter refused to sell, Daniel had used every trick in the book to force him out. He'd manipulated permits, spread rumors, pressured banks to deny loans. Within a year, Carter's company had collapsed. Daniel's face went pale. Your father. My father lost everything because of you, Natalie continued, and now tears were streaming down her face. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for his entire life. You took it all. And do you know what happened then? Daniel couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. He couldn't live with the shame, Natalie said, her voice breaking. He couldn't face what you'd done to our family. So one night he went into the garage, and he ended his life. My mother found him the next morning. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. He stumbled backward, reaching for the wall to steady himself. After he died, we lost our house, Natalie went on, her voice gaining strength from the anger. My mother and I had nothing. We lived in a tiny apartment, barely able to afford food. I was pregnant at the time, Daniel. Did you know that? I was going to have a baby. Daniel's legs felt weak. He sat down heavily on the couch. But the stress, the grief, the poverty, it was too much. I lost the baby. I lost my father, my home, my child, everything. All because you wanted a piece of land for one of your luxury developments. Natalie walked closer to him now, and he could see the pain in every line of her face, in the way she held her fuller body with both pride and sadness. And you want to know something else? She continued, her voice dropping lower. When I was at my lowest, when I was grieving and poor and pregnant, I'd see you in magazines. You, with your perfect life and your perfect girlfriends. All those thin, beautiful women. And I'd think about how people like you see people like me. We're invisible. We're not even worth noticing. So when Robert told me about this bet, when he explained that you needed to marry someone who didn't fit your type, I knew exactly what that meant. I knew you saw this as some kind of punishment for yourself, having to be with someone like me. She paused, wiping her tears. So I agreed. Not for the money, but to make you feel what I felt. To make you understand what it's like to be powerless, to be ignored, to have everything you thought mattered mean nothing at all. And to show you that someone you would normally never even see, someone you'd consider beneath you, could bring you to your knees. Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt genuine shame. Not embarrassment or frustration, but deep, crushing shame. Natalie, I didn't know. I never meant for. You never meant for what? She cut him off sharply. You never meant to destroy lives? But you did, Daniel. You did it without even thinking about it. My father was just an obstacle to you. A problem to solve. You probably celebrated when his company finally went under, didn't you? Daniel wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. Because she was right. He had celebrated. He'd taken his team out for expensive dinners, toasted to his victory, never once thinking about the human cost. Every smile you couldn't get from me, Natalie continued. Every time I ignored you, every moment you felt frustrated and powerless. That was intentional. I wanted you to suffer, even just a little bit of what you put my family through. And I wanted you to know that the woman you married is a joke, the woman whose body type you'd never normally look at twice, is the one who's in control now. She turned away from him, wiping her tears. Now you know the truth. Now you understand who I really am and why I'm here. We still have 4.5 months left on this agreement, Daniel. And I'm going to make sure you remember every single day what you did to my family. With that, she walked to her room and closed the door, leaving Daniel alone with the crushing weight of his past sins and no idea how to make any of it right. After that night, everything changed. Daniel felt like he was living in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Every morning, he'd open his eyes and remember what Natalie had told him. Every time he saw her, he saw Thomas Carter's face in his memory, a man he'd barely thought about in years. But Natalie wasn't done. If anything, learning that he finally understood who she was only made her more determined to make him suffer. She stopped speaking to him entirely. Not even one-word answers anymore. When Daniel tried to apologize, she'd walk right past him like he wasn't there. And he realized this was exactly how he'd made her feel her entire life. Invisible. Not worth noticing. She was a larger woman in a world that often looked right through people like her. And he'd been part of that world, part of that cruelty, without even realizing it. And it wasn't just at home. Natalie started interfering with his business in subtle, devastating ways. Daniel would show up to important meetings only to find they'd been canceled. Deals he was certain would close suddenly fell apart at the last minute. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions about his past. Business practices. At first, Daniel didn't understand what was happening. But then he noticed the pattern. Every setback, every problem, somehow traced back to information that only someone close to him would know. Natalie was using her position as his wife to undermine everything he'd built. One night, he came home after losing a major contract, something that would have made him millions. He found Natalie in the kitchen, calmly making herself tea. "This was you, wasn't it?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "The Harrison deal. You said something to them." Natalie looked at him with those cold eyes. "I simply told them the truth about how you operate. About the families you've displaced. About the small businesses you've crushed. They decided for themselves that they didn't want to work with someone like that. You're destroying everything I've worked for." "No," Natalie corrected him quietly. "I'm just showing people who you really are. You destroyed my family's life work without a second thought. Now you're getting a taste of what that feels like. And honestly, Daniel, this is nothing compared to what you did to us." Daniel felt himself breaking. He wasn't sleeping anymore. He'd lie awake at night, thinking about Thomas Carter, about Natalie's lost baby, about all the other families he'd hurt over the years without even knowing their names. And he thought about Natalie, about how he'd agreed to marry her as if it were some kind of punishment, how he'd seen her body as something to tolerate rather than a person to respect. His friends started noticing the change in him. Robert, who'd started this whole thing with the bet, pulled him aside at a business lunch. "Daniel, you look terrible. What's going on with you? Is it really that hard being married to a fat woman?" The casual cruelty in Robert's words Daniel himself would have used months ago, made him feel sick. "Don't," Daniel said sharply. "Don't talk about her like that." Robert looked surprised. "Whoa, since when do you care? This was supposed to be a joke, remember?" "It was never funny," Daniel said quietly. "And I was an idiot for thinking it was." The weeks dragged on. Daniel stopped going to the office regularly. He'd sit in his penthouse, watching Natalie move through her day with confidence and grace despite everything she'd been through. Despite living in a world that constantly told her she wasn't good enough, and he felt the weight of his guilt crushing him. He tried everything to reach her, to make her understand that he was sorry. He left notes apologizing. She threw them away without reading them. He tried to give her money for her mother. She refused to touch it. He tried to explain that he was young and ambitious and didn't understand the consequences of his actions back then. She told him that ignorance wasn't an excuse for cruelty. One particularly bad evening, Daniel broke down completely. He'd been drinking, something he rarely did, and he found himself standing outside Natalie's bedroom door. "I'm sorry," he said through the door, his voice cracking. "Natalie, I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't bring your father back or your baby or any of it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was cruel and selfish and wrong about everything. About business, about people, about you." He heard movement inside the room, but the door didn't open. "Every day I wake up and I hate myself for what I did," Daniel continued, tears streaming down his face now. "You think you're punishing me, but the worst punishment is knowing what I did and not being able to take it back. And knowing that I looked at you as some kind of burden when you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Still, the door didn't open. Daniel slid down to the floor, sitting with his back against the wall. "I'd give everything I have, every penny, every property, everything, if I could undo what I did to your family. And if I could undo the way I thought about you, the way I agreed to this bet like marrying you was some kind of punishment instead of the privilege it should have been." He sat there for a long time in the silence. Finally, he heard Natalie's voice, soft but clear through the door. "Good," she said. "Now you understand what real pain feels like. Now you know what it's like to want something desperately and not be able to have it. That's how my mother felt when she couldn't save my father. That's how I felt when I lost my baby. And that's how I've felt my entire life, being invisible to people like you. Welcome to the consequences of your actions, Daniel." Her words should have made him angry, but instead, they made him realize something. She was right. He deserved this. He deserved all of it and more. That night marked a turning point for Daniel, though he didn't realize it yet. He stopped trying to defend himself. He stopped trying to make excuses. He simply accepted that he had caused terrible pain. Not just to Natalie's family, but to Natalie herself in ways he was only beginning to understand. But what he didn't know was that Natalie, on the other side of that door, was crying too. Because seeing him broken wasn't bringing her the satisfaction she thought it would. It wasn't bringing her father back. It wasn't healing her pain. Revenge, she was starting to realize, was hollow. But neither of them was ready to admit that yet. Something shifted in Daniel after that night on the floor outside Natalie's room. The next morning, he woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something about the present. He started by making a list. Every property development he could remember, every deal where he'd pushed people out, every family that might have suffered because of his ambition. The list was longer than he expected, and looking at it made him feel sick. But he didn't look away. Daniel began reaching out to people he'd hurt. The first was an elderly couple whose small grocery store had been in their family for 3 generations before Daniel's development forced them to close. He found their address and drove to their modest home in South Boston, his hands shaking as he knocked on the door. The old man who answered recognized him immediately. His expression turned cold. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize," Daniel said simply. "And I want to make things right." The man laughed bitterly. "Make things right? Our store is gone. 20 years we've been struggling since you pushed us out." "I know," Daniel said. "And I can't give you back those years. But I can help now. I want to set up a fund for your grandchildren's education. I want to pay off your mortgage. I want to do whatever I can." Over the next several weeks, Daniel continued this pattern. He visited people, apologized, offered real financial help. Not as a tax write-off or publicity stunt, but as genuine attempts to repair what he'd broken. He set up funds for displaced families. He donated to community centers in neighborhoods his developments had disrupted. He established small business grants for people trying to rebuild. Natalie watched all of this from a distance. At first, she thought it was just another manipulation, another way for Daniel to try to get back in her good graces. But as the days passed and Daniel showed a true transformation, she began to feel something new toward him, renewed respect and admiration she hadn't expected. He stopped buying her expensive things she didn't want. Instead, she'd come home to find small, thoughtful gestures. Her favorite tea waiting in the kitchen. A book by an author she'd mentioned once. Fresh flowers, simple ones, not elaborate arrangements. He'd even found a bakery that made her favorite cookies from childhood. He didn't force conversations anymore. But he was there, quietly present, doing small things that showed he was paying attention to her as a person, not as a prize to be won or a body to judge. One morning, Natalie woke up to find that Daniel had made breakfast. Not an elaborate spread, just simple pancakes and coffee made exactly the way she liked it. Strong, no sugar. There was a note. No expectations. Just thought you might be hungry. Despite herself, Natalie felt something crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. That evening, for the first time in months, Natalie initiated a conversation. Daniel was on the balcony, and she joined him there, standing a few feet away. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, surprised she was talking to him. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I finally understand that my actions have consequences. Because you showed me who I really was, and I didn't like what I saw. This doesn't erase what you did to my family." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "Nothing will ever erase that. But I'm not doing this to erase it or to make you forgive me. I'm doing this because it's what I should have been doing all along, seeing people as people, not as obstacles or opportunities. And that includes you, Natalie." She looked at him, surprised. "I was cruel," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to your father, but to you. I agreed to marry you like it was some kind of punishment, like being with a woman who didn't fit society's ridiculous beauty standards was something to endure. But you're beautiful, Natalie. Not in spite of anything, just you're beautiful. And you're strong and smart and more dignified than anyone I've ever known. I was too shallow and stupid to see it." Natalie felt tears welling up in her eyes. No one had ever talked to her like this before, with such genuine respect and admiration. "My father used to say that a person's character isn't shown by how they treat people who can do something for them, but by how they treat people who can't," she said softly. "He was right," Daniel said. "And by that measure, I had no character at all. I treated people like your father as obstacles. And I treated people like you, people who didn't fit my narrow definition of what I thought I wanted, as invisible." "Had?" Natalie asked, looking at him directly for the first time in weeks. I'm trying, Daniel replied. I'm trying to be someone different. Someone better. Not just for you, though I wish I could earn your forgiveness someday. But for myself. Because I don't want to be that person anymore. The person who only values things he can see on the surface. They stood in silence, looking out at the city. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first crack in the ice between them. As the days went on, their interactions became less hostile. Natalie would sometimes ask Daniel about his day, about the families he was helping. Daniel would share honestly, not hiding the difficult conversations or the people who refused his help entirely. One night, about 4 months into their 6-month agreement, Natalie found Daniel looking at old photos on his laptop. She recognized her father in one of them, a newspaper article about the development deal. I look at his face every day now, Daniel said quietly, not realizing she was there. I want to remember him. Remember that he was a real person with a family and dreams. Not just someone in my way. Natalie felt tears welling up in her eyes. She turned to leave, but then stopped. Daniel, she said softly. He looked up, surprised to see her there. Thank you, she said, for finally seeing him. For finally seeing all of them. For finally seeing me. It was the first kind thing she'd said to him since the revelation, and Daniel felt his heart ache with hope and regret all mixed together. I see you, Natalie, he replied. And I'm so sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry for everything I took from you. And I'm sorry for every way I ever made you feel like you weren't enough, when the truth is, I was never enough for you. Natalie nodded, wiping her tears. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She sat down next to him on the couch, not touching, but close. It was the first time they'd shared a space voluntarily since the revelation. Tell me about the families you visited today, she said quietly. And Daniel did. And for the first time, they talked like two people who were beginning to understand each other. Beginning, perhaps, to care. That night, for the first time since she'd revealed the truth, Natalie didn't lock her door. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward after all. With only 2 months left in their 6-month agreement, something neither Daniel nor Natalie expected began to happen. They started to fall in love. Not the superficial attraction Daniel was used to, but something deeper, built on honesty, pain, and genuine change. It started small. They began having breakfast together, not in uncomfortable silence, but with real conversation. Natalie would tell him about her work. She'd been volunteering at a community center, helping families facing displacement. Daniel would share about his meetings with the people he'd hurt, the hard conversations, the ones who forgave him and the many who didn't. Mrs. Patterson still won't talk to me, Daniel said one morning, referring to an elderly woman whose bookstore his development had closed. She just closed the door in my face. Can you blame her? Natalie asked, but her tone wasn't cruel anymore. It was honest. No, Daniel replied. I can't. And that's okay. Some things can't be fixed, no matter how hard you try. Natalie studied him for a moment. You've really changed, haven't you? I'm trying, Daniel said. Every single day, I'm trying to be better than I was. One evening, they were both on the couch, something that would have been impossible months earlier. Natalie was reading, and Daniel was working on his laptop. At one point, she shifted her position, and her arm brushed against his. She didn't pull away immediately, and neither did he. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Later that week, Daniel came home with shopping bags. Natalie looked up, suspicious. I'm not buying you designer clothes you don't want, he said quickly. But I saw this bookstore, the kind of small independent place I would have ignored before. And they had this cookbook you mentioned once, about traditional recipes. I thought you might like it. Natalie took the book, running her fingers over the cover. You remembered that? I remember everything you tell me now, Daniel said simply. I'm paying attention in ways I never did before. They started taking walks together through the neighborhoods Daniel's developments had affected. One evening, they passed a plus-size clothing boutique, and Natalie paused, looking in the window. What is it? Daniel asked. Nothing, she said. It's just, I've always loved that dress in the window. But it's expensive, and I've never had a reason to buy it. The next week, Daniel did something he'd never done before. He went into that boutique, asked for help from the staff, and carefully selected not just that dress but several other pieces he thought Natalie would love. But he didn't just buy them randomly. He asked questions, learned about proper sizing, listened when the shop owner talked about how to find clothes that fit and flatter different body types. He was learning to see beauty in ways he'd never allowed himself to before. When he gave Natalie the shopping bags, she was speechless. "How did you?" "I paid attention," Daniel said. "And I asked for help from people who know better than me. Natalie, I spent my whole life thinking beauty looked one specific way, because that's what the world told me. But you've shown me that I was wrong about so many things. You're beautiful exactly as you are. And I want you to have things that make you feel as beautiful as you are." Natalie cried then, really cried, and for the first time, she let Daniel hold her. As the weeks went on, they grew closer. They'd share meals, watch movies, talk about their days. Daniel pointed out buildings he'd developed and now saw differently, seeing the communities that were displaced, the small businesses that were lost. Natalie shared memories of her father, letting Daniel see the man he'd never known, the man whose life he'd destroyed. One night, with just 3 weeks left in their agreement, Daniel took Natalie to a place he'd never shown anyone, a small community garden in a neighborhood his development had affected. He'd been secretly funding it, helping to create a space where families could grow food and gather together. "This is beautiful," Natalie said, walking through the garden paths. "It's not enough," Daniel replied. "It doesn't make up for what was lost. But it's something, a place for people to heal, to grow things, to be together." Natalie turned to him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "Daniel, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "When I came into this marriage, I wanted to hurt you. I wanted you to suffer like my family suffered. But somewhere along the way, watching you change, watching you actually care about the people you hurt, watching you learn to see me as more than just my body, I stopped wanting revenge." Daniel's heart was racing. "What do you want now?" "I want—" Natalie hesitated, then continued. "I want to believe that people can change. I want to believe that something good can come from something that started so wrong. I want to believe in you. And I want to believe that someone can love me not despite who I am, but because of who I am." "Natalie," Daniel said, taking both her hands in his, "I'm in love with you. Not the idea of you, not because of any bet, but really, truly in love with you. You made me see the worst parts of myself, and then you gave me the chance to become better. You're strong and brilliant, and yes, beautiful, so beautiful it hurts. And I know I don't deserve your love, but—" "Stop," Natalie interrupted, placing a finger on his lips. "You're right that you didn't deserve it at first. But the man you are now, the man who spends his days trying to repair what he broke, the man who looks at my father's picture every day to remember that his actions have consequences, the man who sees me, really sees me for who I am, that man I could love." "Could?" Daniel asked, hardly daring to hope. "Do," Natalie corrected, smiling through tears. "That man I do love." They kissed then, in the community garden Daniel had built as an apology to a neighborhood he'd hurt, and it felt like a new beginning. The 6-month agreement ended, but they decided to start over, to have a real wedding, this time based on love and truth. It was small and simple, with Natalie's mother there, tears of joy running down her face as she saw her daughter finally happy. Even a few of the families Daniel had helped came, people who'd seen his genuine change and chosen to forgive. 3 months after their real wedding, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. When she told Daniel, he cried, not just from joy but from the weight of what this meant. A new life, a chance to do things right, to be the kind of father and husband he'd never thought he could be. "I'm scared," he admitted to Natalie, his hand gently resting on her growing belly. "What if I mess this up? What if I hurt our child the way I hurt so many others?" Natalie took his face in her hands, looking into his eyes with all the love she'd never thought she'd feel for him. "The man who destroyed my father's life would never ask that question. But you're not that man anymore. You've changed, Daniel. And I believe in you." As they prepared for their child's arrival, Daniel continued his work of making amends. He knew he could never fully repay all the pain he'd caused, but he would spend the rest of his life trying. He established a foundation in Thomas Carter's name, helping small business owners who faced unfair competition from large developers. He hired people from the communities his developments had displaced. He became an advocate for fair housing and ethical business practices. Natalie's mother, who had been skeptical at first, slowly welcomed Daniel into the family. One afternoon, she pulled him aside at a family gathering. "My husband was a good man," she said, her eyes filled with old pain. "What you did nearly destroyed me too. But I see how you've changed. I see how you love my daughter, how you honor my husband's memory. Thomas would have appreciated that. He always believed people could be better if they chose to be." Daniel felt tears running down his face. I wish I could have known him. I wish I could tell him how sorry I am. You honor him by being a better man, she replied, squeezing his hand. That's the best apology you could give. 9 months after their real wedding, on a beautiful spring morning, Natalie gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Grace, for the grace they'd both received, the second chances they'd been given. As Daniel held his daughter for the first time, looking at her tiny, perfect face, he thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The arrogance, the cruelty, the destruction. The bet that was supposed to be a joke. The woman he'd agreed to marry as if it were a punishment. The revelation that shattered his world. The long, painful journey toward becoming someone worth loving. Thank you, he whispered to Natalie as she rested in the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. For what? She asked, smiling softly. For not giving up on me. For showing me the truth even when it hurt. For letting me earn your love instead of just demanding it. For seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. Natalie reached for his hand. We saved each other, Daniel. I was drowning in anger and grief, and you gave me something I didn't expect. You gave me hope that people can change. That justice doesn't always have to be about destruction. That love can grow in the most unexpected places. One evening, about a year after Grace was born, Daniel and Natalie stood together in their home. No longer the cold penthouse, but a warm house filled with family photos, baby toys, and laughter. They were looking at a framed photo of Thomas Carter that Natalie had placed in their living room. I talk to him sometimes, Daniel admitted. I tell him about Grace, about us, about the work I'm doing. I know he can't hear me, but maybe he can, Natalie said gently. And I think he'd be proud of you. Not for the money or the success, but for having the courage to change. Daniel pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. Do you remember what you said to me that first night we met? You said 6 months, and then we'd go our separate ways. Natalie laughed. I remember. I was so angry, so determined to make you suffer. I'm glad you failed at that, Daniel said with a smile. Or rather, I'm glad that somewhere along the way, you decided there was a better ending to this story. Who would have thought? Natalie mused, leaning into his embrace. That a bet made as a cruel joke would lead to this. To love. To family. To real happiness. Daniel looked around their home, at the life they'd built together. A life based not on money or appearances, but on honesty, growth, and genuine love. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who valued all the wrong things, who hurt people without thinking, who judged worth by superficial standards. It was the most important loss I ever experienced, Daniel said thoughtfully. I lost my old self, all that arrogance, that cruelty, that blindness, and I found something infinitely better. I found you. I found purpose. I found the man I was always supposed to be. Natalie smiled, tears of happiness in her eyes. And I found forgiveness. I found that letting go of hate doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing to build something new from the ashes of the past. Years passed. Grace grew up in a home filled with love, learning from her parents' story about accountability, forgiveness, and second chances. Daniel continued his foundation work, helping dozens of families rebuild their lives. He never forgot what he'd done, never let himself off the hook, but he also learned to accept that he was allowed to be happy, allowed to love and be loved. On their 5th wedding anniversary, their real wedding anniversary, Daniel and Natalie returned to the community garden where he'd first told her he loved her. It had grown more beautiful over the years, and it was filled with families from the neighborhood, growing food, playing, living. This is your legacy, Natalie said, gesturing to the garden and the happy families around them. Not the buildings or the money. This, the lives you've helped rebuild, the people you've supported, the man you've become. Daniel squeezed her hand. Our legacy, he corrected. Because none of this would exist without you. You broke me down so I could be rebuilt into someone better. You taught me what real beauty looks like. Not the superficial kind I used to chase, but the beauty of strength, integrity, and genuine goodness. As the sun set over the garden, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat together on a bench, watching Grace play with other children, and Daniel thought about the journey that brought them here. It started with a bet, a cruel, thoughtless bet that was supposed to prove his superiority. Instead, it proved his biggest weaknesses and gave him the chance to overcome them. It brought him a wife he'd married as a punishment, but who became his greatest blessing. It cost him everything he thought mattered and gave him everything that actually did. I love you, Daniel said, not for the first time, but meaning it more deeply than ever. "I love you too," Natalie replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Even though you were the worst bet anyone ever made." They laughed together, and the sound carried across the garden. The sound of two people who'd walked through fire and came out stronger, who'd turned revenge into redemption, and who'd proven that sometimes the most broken beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. And that's their story. A story that began with cruelty and a joke, transformed through pain and truth, and ended in real, lasting love. Daniel never forgot the harm he'd caused. He carried it with him always. But he also learned that carrying guilt doesn't mean you can't also carry joy. That making amends is a lifelong journey, not a destination. And that sometimes the person who shows you your worst self is the only one who can help you become your best self. What do you think? Did Natalie make the right choice in forgiving Daniel? Can people who've caused real harm truly change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you think about second chances and the power of transformation, please subscribe for more stories about love, loss, and the beautiful mess of being human. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Thank you for believing that even broken people deserve a chance to become whole.